Chicago in January is not romantic. It is brutal. It is honest. It strips everything down to its bones. The wind off Lake Michigan doesn't ask permission before it cuts through your coat, through your skin, through whatever illusions you've been carrying around. The city tells the truth whether you want it to or not. I had been lying to myself for 26 years. My name is Emily Carter. On paper, that name means something. It opens doors in this city. The right restaurants, the right boardrooms, the right zip codes. My mother, Victoria Carter, built that name into a small empire, Carter Holdings, a real estate and private equity firm that had swallowed up half a dozen smaller companies and spit them out as subsidiaries. She wore the name like armor. She expected me to wear it the same way. I wore it like a noose. That January evening, I was standing in the kitchen of our family's Gold Coast penthouse, watching Lake Michigan freeze in degrees, listening to my mother lay out the terms of my future, as though she were reviewing a quarterly earnings report. The Whitmore family is a strategic fit, she said, not looking up from the document on the marble island. Her voice was the same temperature it always was, precise, controlled, calibrated for effect. Harrison Whitmore is 34, established, and his father's construction portfolio complements our commercial holdings perfectly. You're describing a merger, I said, not a marriage. She looked up then. Her eyes gray like the sky outside assessed me with the same expression she used when a contractor had missed a deadline. Don't be sentimental, Emily. Sentiment is expensive. Harrison Whitmore was not a bad man in the way that villains are bad. He was bad the way that cold rooms are bad. Not actively cruel, just fundamentally incapable of warmth. I had met him twice. Both times he had looked at me the way he looked at his watch, evaluating, calculating return on investment. I won't marry him, I said. You will, my mother replied and turned the page. That was the thing about Victoria Carter. She didn't argue. She didn't negotiate from a position of uncertainty. She stated outcomes. She had decided what my life would look like. And she had been deciding for so long that she had forgotten or perhaps never believed that I had the capacity to decide for myself. I left the kitchen. I took the elevator down 17 floors. I walked out into the cold. The snow was falling in sheets, the kind that muffles the city's noise and makes Chicago feel, for a few minutes, like it belongs to no one. I didn't have a destination. I just walked, letting the wind push me south along Michigan Avenue, my heels clicking on the salted sidewalk, my breath a small cloud that disappeared before it could amount to anything. I passed boutiques with their windows fogged and golden. I passed a woman walking a dog the size of a small horse. I passed a man in a canvas jacket who was crouched beside a parking meter doing something with a wrench and a bucket of tools, utterly unbothered by the weather. I didn't notice when my heel caught the ice. I noticed when I was falling. And then I noticed the hand, large, sure, unambiguous, that caught my arm before I hit the ground. Careful, he said. I looked up. The man from the parking meter. Up close, he was taller than I'd registered, a black man in his early 30s with deep brown skin, tightly curled hair dusted with snowflakes, and eyes that were, I didn't have a better word for it than quiet. Not empty, quiet, like a room before someone speaks. Thank you, I said, and straightened. I expected him to nod and go back to his meter. He didn't move immediately. He looked at me for a beat too long. Not rude, not presumptuous, just noticing. And then he said, "You should get inside. The sidewalks are getting bad." "I know how sidewalks work," I said. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "I know you do." He crouched back down to his tools. I walked 3 steps away and turned around. There was something in his stillness that irritated me. Something in the way he seemed to belong exactly where he was. "Do you work for the city?" I asked. "I work for myself," he said without looking up. "Plumbing mostly. That meter's been leaking into the foundation of the building next door for 6 months. The city's been ignoring the work order." "So you're fixing it on your own?" He looked up. Then I walked away. I thought about him exactly once more that night. The stillness, the wrench, the matter-of-fact competence of a person who fixed things because they needed fixing and then forgot him entirely in the chaos of my mother's campaign to schedule the engagement announcement. She had already drafted a press release. I found it in my email at 11 p.m. Carter Holdings is pleased to announce the upcoming union of Emily Carter and Harrison Whitmore III, son of Gerald and Patricia Whitmore of Lake Forest. She had written it in the third person, the way you write about a property transaction. I read it twice and then put my phone face down on the pillow and stared at the ceiling for an hour. In the morning, I called Becca. She said what she said. I thought what I thought for 2 hours, and then I went back to Wabash Avenue. I didn't forget him for long. 3 days later, I was in a coffee shop on Wabash Avenue, not drinking my coffee, watching the street outside, and trying to construct an exit from a situation that had no logical exit. My mother's terms were not subtle. Marry Harrison Whitmore by Valentine's Day. She had actually chosen Valentine's Day with the kind of cruel irony that only the unromantic are capable of. Or she would restructure my trust arrangement and remove me from the board position. She had recently strategically placed me in the board seat. I'd spent 4 years earning the board seat that represented the only real leverage I had over my own financial future. Marry someone else first, my college roommate Becca had said over the phone that morning, unhelpfully and yet also helpfully. I don't know anyone I want to marry, I'd said. Doesn't have to be real, she'd said. I'd hung up on her. Then I'd sat with it for 2 hours. A marriage of convenience. A contract. Something legal enough to block my mother's plans while I found a real solution. She couldn't force me to marry Harrison if I was already married, and she couldn't easily undo a legal marriage without the kind of public mess she avoided on principle. The problem was, I didn't know anyone who would agree to something this strange without wanting something from me that I wasn't willing to give. My world was full of people who calculated every favor. Everyone in my circle knew my mother. Everyone would talk. It had to be someone outside my world entirely. I was so deep in this calculation that I almost didn't notice him coming in. The man from the parking meter, stomping snow off his boots at the door, ordering black coffee at the counter, settling into the chair across the room with the comfortable ease of someone who had nowhere else to be. He didn't notice me immediately. He was reading something in a battered paperback, Meditations. I noticed Marcus Aurelius, and he had the same quality of stillness that had caught my attention 3 days ago. I made a decision before I'd fully thought it through. I walked to his table. "You fixed the meter," I said. He looked up, recognized me, didn't seem particularly surprised. "The building's foundation will stop flooding now. Can I sit down?" He gestured at the chair across from him. I sat. I wrapped my hands around my own cold coffee cup and looked at him directly because if I was going to say what I was about to say, I needed to say it like I meant it. "I need to ask you something unusual," I said. "All right. I need someone to marry me temporarily. Legally, but temporarily. We'd have a private agreement about the terms, and I would compensate you for the inconvenience. It would protect you financially and cost you nothing except a few months of a certain level of proximity." He didn't blink. He looked at me the way he'd looked at the parking meter, as though he were assessing the actual problem beneath the surface problem. "Why me?" he said. "Because you're not from my world, and you don't want anything from it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I have a daughter. She's 7. Naomi. I know what a child means in this situation." "She would be safe," I said. "You both would be. You don't know anything about me." "I know you fix things other people ignore," I said. "That's more than I know about most people." Something shifted in his expression. "Not much. Just a degree or two of recalibration." He looked out the window. The snow was coming down again. "I'll need to think about it," he said. "I need an answer by tomorrow morning." He looked back at me. "Then come back tomorrow morning." I came back. He said yes. He told me his name was Malcolm Mitchell. He said he was 31. He said his daughter Naomi was his whole world, and that he was willing to consider anything that made her life more stable. He said the words "financially comfortable" when he agreed to my terms, and I noticed, without fully processing, that he didn't say "financially desperate." We were married 6 days later at the Cook County Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in front of a clerk who looked like she'd witnessed stranger things, and perhaps had. The ring Malcolm produced was a plain gold band that fit as though someone had measured for it. I didn't ask where it had come from. When Malcolm signed the marriage certificate, a black car pulled up to the curb outside the courthouse window. Long, quiet, expensive. A man in a dark suit stepped out and stood beside it, hands clasped, waiting. Malcolm glanced at the car. His expression didn't change. The man outside nodded barely perceptibly and got back in the car. I filed it away. I had other things to deal with. My mother's response to the marriage certificate was a silence so complete it was almost architectural. She received the news through her assistant. I hadn't told her in person, which was, I recognized, a small cruelty and she said nothing for 24 hours. Then she cut off everything. My access to the family accounts, my stipend, the corporate card, the apartment in Lincoln Park that she'd been paying for. I had anticipated this. I had not fully anticipated how it would feel. Malcolm's apartment was on Huron Street in a building that was clean and well-maintained and resolutely ordinary. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms. A kitchen with a window that looked onto a fire escape where I would learn Malcolm kept a small pot of rosemary that somehow survived Chicago winters because he brought it inside at precisely the right moment. I stood in the living room with 1 suitcase. I'd only taken what I could carry. The rest of my things were still in storage somewhere I wasn't ready to deal with and tried to locate my bearings. The suitcase contained 3 changes of clothes selected in something close to panic, my laptop, a notebook I'd been keeping since college and never quite managed to fill, a photograph of no one in particular that I'd bought at a flea market because I liked the light in it, and the practical documentation of my new legal situation. It was the inventory of a woman who had made a decision faster than she'd made most decisions and was only now beginning to understand what she'd decided. "The bedroom on the left is yours," Malcolm said from behind me. "There's a lock on the door. I'm not... It's there if you want it," he said simply. "Naomi's room is on the right. She knows you're staying here. She knows we got married." I told her you're a friend who needed a place to stay and the married part is complicated, grown-up stuff. "What did she say?" "He asked if you like dinosaurs." What? "She's going through a paleontology phase." He moved to the kitchen. "Put water on." "Do you drink tea? Coffee?" "I'll get coffee tomorrow. Tea tonight." I sat down on the couch, which was worn but not uncomfortable, the kind of furniture that had been lived in rather than selected, and looked around the apartment. There were drawings on the refrigerator, a small backpack by the door with a Triceratops keychain, a bookshelf that had on the bottom 2 shelves the complete illustrated guides to dinosaurs that any serious 7-year-old apparently requires, and on the upper shelves a collection of books that made me pause. Nassim Taleb, Dalio, Marcus Aurelius again, Adam Smith, A History of the Medici Banking Family. Plumbers didn't typically read the history of the Medici banking family. I looked at the books. I looked at the rosemary on the fire escape. I looked at the man in the kitchen making tea with the focused economy of motion of someone who'd spent years being quietly, precisely capable. On the wall near the hallway was a framed photo of a beautiful black family, Malcolm, Naomi, and a warm brown-skinned woman with a radiant smile I had never met. The frame had been handled often. "You don't know anything about me," he'd said. He was right. I knew almost nothing. Naomi Mitchell was 7 years old and had the particular intensity of a child who has decided with great deliberation to love you. She announced this decision on my 3rd morning in the apartment. She appeared at my bedroom door at 7 a.m. She knocked. Malcolm had clearly taught her to knock and said very seriously, "I've decided you can be my friend. Do you want to see my Spinosaurus?" I said yes. I looked at the Spinosaurus, which was large and extremely detailed. I learned more about late Cretaceous aquatic predators than I had ever expected to know. Naomi was bright in the way that children are bright when they've spent a lot of time around one very present adult. She was curious, direct, and utterly unafraid of questions. She asked me what I did for work. I said I was between things. She accepted this without judgment in the way that children sometimes accept things that adults make complicated. She asked why I had sad eyes. "I don't," I said. "You do," she said. "Daddy gets sad eyes sometimes too, but his are different. Yours are like you lost something. His are like he's scared something's going to get taken away." I didn't know what to do with that, so I asked her about the Spinosaurus. Malcolm was harder to read than his daughter, though he left more evidence. The first anomaly. The phone calls. He took them in the back room. Always brief, always low. Once I passed the door and caught 3 words. Hold the position. It was the language of someone managing a portfolio, not a plumbing schedule. The second anomaly. The car. Not the black car from the courthouse that hadn't reappeared, but twice in the first week, a different car had idled across the street from the apartment building. Dark gray. No plates visible. It would be there when I looked out the window at 10 p.m. and gone by morning. The third anomaly. The night I came home late from meeting Becca, she'd needed to see me, reassure herself I wasn't having some kind of breakdown, bring me wine, and found Malcolm at the kitchen table with a legal pad covered in numbers. He turned it over when I came in, quickly practiced. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't hear you come in." "You don't have to turn things over," I said. "It's your home." "It's your home too," he said. For now. The phrase landed oddly. I stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the turned-over legal pad and thought about the fact that a man who had agreed to a marriage of financial convenience had never once mentioned money since the agreement was made. He hadn't asked for anything, he hadn't discussed the terms, he'd simply provided. "Malcolm," I said, "what do you actually do?" "Plumbing," he said, "and some investment work." "What kind of investment work?" He met my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Something in his expression opened slightly, like a window cracking for air, and then closed again. "The boring kind," he said. "Go to bed, Emily. You look tired." I went to bed. I didn't sleep. The fourth anomaly came the next day. When I was walking Naomi home from school and ran into my mother's attorney, Jeffrey Marsh, on the corner of Superior and Dearborn, Jeffrey was surprised to see me. He was more surprised to see Naomi. "Mrs. Carter Mitchell," he said, which was the first time anyone had called me that, and it felt strange in my mouth and stranger in my ears. "It's Mrs. Mitchell," I corrected. "What are you doing here, Jeffrey?" He looked uncomfortable. "I had a meeting." "With whom?" "A client," he said, and excused himself with the speed of a man who had said too much. That night, I searched Malcolm Mitchell in every database I could access. Public records, property records, court filings, business registrations. There was almost nothing. A plumbing license, a single LLC registered in Illinois, DM Property Services, with no further detail visible, a vehicle registration, a lease agreement for the apartment. For a person who existed, he left almost no trace. I was beginning to understand, a choice. Victoria Carter didn't storm my life. She didn't make scenes. She had never needed to. She summoned me. The invitation came through her assistant, not even a phone call, a text message, which was her way of indicating that she was choosing to be casual about something she was actually very serious about. Lunch. Tuesday. The club. 12:30. I went. Partly because refusing would have been strategically poor. Partly because some part of me still obeyed her reflexively. The way you flinch before you've decided to flinch. The club was all dark wood and white tablecloths, the kind of place where the city's established money had been having the same lunch for 40 years. My mother was already seated. She looked, as always, impeccable charcoal wool suit, her silver hair cut close, her posture, the posture of a person who had decided that the world would accommodate her. She waited until the waiter had poured water and withdrawn before she spoke. "Tell me about him," she said. "You've already had him investigated," I said. "You know as much as I do." A pause. Surprisingly little for a man who, she chose her next word carefully, seems to have made an impression. "He's a plumber." "He's something else," she said. I kept my face still. "Based on what?" She looked at me with the expression she reserved for people who were wasting her time. "Emily, I've been in business in this city for 30 years. I know every family with assets worth knowing. I know every mid-level operator. I know every trustworthy contractor and every fraudulent one. Malcolm Mitchell and whatever he's actually operating under is invisible to everyone I know. That is not the profile of a plumber. Maybe your contacts have gaps. I don't have gaps." She set down her water glass. "I'm going to find out who he is, and when I do, I want you to understand that whatever arrangement you've constructed with him, I will dismantle it. You can come home. The board seat is still available. Harrison is still interested." "Harrison is interested in the Carter name," I said. "Not in me." "What's the difference?" I looked at my mother across the white tablecloth. She was 61 years old. She had built something significant. She had also, I thought, never once in my recollection asked me what I wanted. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not as an adult. She had told me what I wanted. She had been very precise about it. "The difference," I said, "is everything." She smiled thinly. "Come back to reality, Emily. He'll disappoint you." I left before dessert. I walked out of the club and stood on Erie Street in the wind and felt, for the first time, something close to clarity. My mother had spent 30 years being so certain about everything that she'd never had to wonder what she'd lost in the process of being right. She'd built something significant. She'd also built a daughter who had needed to marry a stranger to feel free. I wondered if she'd ever connect those two facts. I suspected she had the capacity to, if she ever stopped long enough to look. But looking required stillness, and Victoria Carter had not been still in 30 years. I walked home, not a cab, not a ride share, home on foot, through the cold, past the salted sidewalks and the buildings Malcolm had told me over several evenings and fragments of conversation. He knew by name the Hendricks building on Ontario, the old Keller and Sons warehouse they'd converted on Huron, the corner property on Wells that had been a dry cleaner for 40 years before a bad winter and a worse landlord had finally ended it, and which Malcolm had quietly purchased and rented to a family-run alterations business at below market rate. He knew his city differently than my mother knew hers. She knew who owned what. He knew what things were for. When I got home, Malcolm was in the kitchen with Naomi, helping her build what appeared to be a scale model of a Cretaceous landscape out of modeling clay and small plastic trees. They were arguing gently about whether the water level was correct. The seaway was more extensive, Naomi was insisting. I showed you the map. The map was from a single source, Malcolm said. Good scientists check multiple sources. I checked 3. Then adjust the shoreline. She adjusted the shoreline. She looked up and saw me in the doorway. Emily, can you settle a dispute? Was the western interior seaway deeper on the eastern or western margin? I have no idea, I said. Eastern, she and Malcolm said simultaneously. He looked up at me. Something in his face asked a question he didn't say out loud. How did it go? Fine, I said, which answered nothing and which he accepted without pressing. That night, lying in my room with the lock I'd never used, I thought about how my mother had said he'll disappoint you with the certainty of someone laying out a forecast. And I thought about the fact that in 3 weeks of living in this apartment, Malcolm Mitchell had not once disappointed me. He had been strange and guarded and deeply private, and occasionally, briefly, something warmer than that. But he had not disappointed me. I thought that was probably worth something. I didn't know yet how much. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late February when the thing happened that made everything impossible to ignore. Naomi had a half day from school. Malcolm was on a job, or said he was, and I'd offered to pick her up and walk her home, which had become a regular arrangement that neither of us had formally agreed to and neither of us questioned. We were 3 blocks from the apartment, Naomi deep in a lecture about the relative intelligence of various theropods, when a car, the gray one, no plates, pulled up alongside us. 2 men got out. They weren't threatening, they weren't displaying anything, but they moved with the particular studied casualness of people who are pretending not to be doing something deliberate. And Naomi went quiet beside me with the instinct of a child who has been taught at some point to recognize a certain kind of attention. Emily Carter, one of the men said. Not Mitchell. Carter? Yes, I said. My voice was steady. I put my hand on Naomi's shoulder. We have a message from... A black SUV turned the corner at speed. Not recklessly controlled, precise, and stopped at the curb. The driver's door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out. And then the back door opened and Malcolm stepped out. And he was not, in any way I could articulate, the same man who made tea in the kitchen and argued about paleontological water levels. He was absolutely, completely still. Get in the car, he said to me and Naomi. Not loud, not aggressive, the kind of voice that has decided the conversation is over. Naomi took 3 quick steps to him and pressed her face against his coat. He put one arm around her, and his eyes stayed on the 2 men who were now, and this was extraordinary, backing up toward their own vehicle with the body language of people who had made a significant miscalculation. This isn't the place, the taller one said. There's no place, Malcolm said. Tell your employer that. The men got in the car. The car left. Malcolm looked at me. Are you all right? Who were those people? People making a point, he said. Get in the car. I got in. Naomi was already buckled in the back seat, her jaw set with the particular tightness of a child who was very scared and very determined not to show it. I reached back and took her hand, and she held it without speaking. At the apartment, Malcolm took Naomi to her room and came back to the kitchen, where I was standing and waiting. It's time, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked slightly, minimally tired. My name is Malcolm Darius Mitchell, he said. I own DM Capital, several subsidiaries, and a significant portion of the commercial real estate in this city. Approximately 43% of the assessed value of the Loop's major properties, if you want a number. The kitchen was very quiet. You're worth, I started. More than your mother, he said, not as a boast, as a fact. Why the plumbing? Because I needed to know what my properties actually required, he said. Because I had spent 4 years in boardrooms and I'd forgotten what things were made of. Because after my wife died, I needed to do something that had a beginning and an end and a clear result. He paused. And because Naomi needed a father who came home smelling like work, not like a negotiation. Your wife, I said, 3 years ago. Cancer. The words were short and complete, and he didn't elaborate. Those men? A competitor. Someone who wants a particular parcel of land I own in the South Loop. He's been applying pressure in various ways. He knows who I am. Did you know who I was when I sat down at your table in that coffee shop? The pause before his answer was a fraction too long. Yes, he said. The words sat between us. You knew I was Victoria Carter's daughter, I said, and you still agreed. He looked at his hands on the table. Deep brown hands, capable hands, resting flat against the wood as though stillness itself were discipline. Because your plan was real, he said. You needed something real for a real reason, and you were willing to ask a stranger for it without any performance. You sat down and said what it was. I've spent years in rooms full of people who can't do that. He looked up, and because Naomi asked if you liked dinosaurs and seemed to already know the answer, I sat down. My legs were not fully cooperating. I'm not angry, I said, which surprised me because I'd expected to be. I should be. But I think you were also real with me, in your way. I wasn't fully honest. No, I agreed. But you weren't pretending to be something lesser than you are for reasons that had nothing to do with me. He thought about that. Were they... No, he said. They had nothing to do with you. The night after Malcolm's disclosure, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and recalculated everything. The apartment that was a choice, not a necessity. The plumbing work that was education, not desperation. The Medici book on the shelf. The quiet phone calls. The gray car that had apparently been his people watching, not enemies, but security that he'd deployed without telling me, which meant he'd been protecting me for weeks without making it a fact I had to manage. I felt the particular vertigo of a narrative shifting under your feet. And somewhere in that vertigo, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The awareness that in 3 weeks this man had not once made me feel like a problem to be solved. My mother spent 30 years treating me like a strategic asset. Harrison Whitmore had looked at me like a line item. Malcolm Mitchell looked at me like a person. And he'd looked at me that way when he thought he was a secret and when he wasn't. That meant something. What it meant for the agreement we had made, the tidy contract, the private arrangement, the end date we'd never specified I didn't know yet. 2 days later, my mother made her move. She had found out. I wasn't sure how. Her network was deep and someone had clearly talked, or she'd hired people capable enough to dig through the shell structures Malcolm used, but she knew that Malcolm Mitchell was DM Capital. And she arrived at the apartment on a Thursday evening with Jeffrey Marsh and a proposition. Malcolm answered the door. He was in a flannel shirt and jeans with a smear of modeling clay on one wrist. He and Naomi had been working on phase 2 of the Cretaceous diorama, and he looked at my mother with an expression of complete pleasant neutrality. Victoria, he said, come in. My mother stepped into the apartment. She looked around it the way she looked at real estate, assessing value and finding it incorrectly arranged. Then she saw Naomi peering around the kitchen doorway, and something moved across her face quickly that I'd never seen on it before. She looked away. Naomi, Malcolm said quietly, go work on the water levels. I'll be right in. Naomi looked at my mother. Hello, she said, with the grave politeness of a child meeting someone she's decided not to trust yet. Hello, my mother said. Naomi retreated. My mother sat down on the couch with Jeffrey and laid out her terms. The terms were as follows. She would recognize the marriage. She would restore my board seat. She would provide capital for a joint venture between Carter Holdings and DM Capital that would benefit everyone. In exchange, Malcolm would cease a certain acquisition he was apparently pursuing in the South Loop that conflicted with a development project of hers, and I would take a more active role in Carter Holdings on her terms. Malcolm listened to all of this. Then he said no. My mother blinked. I beg your pardon? The South Loop acquisition is proceeding. Emily's board seat is hers by right, and your withholding it is already being evaluated by her attorney. I hadn't known he'd done that. And the terms of your proposed joint venture would require me to restructure 3 existing agreements in ways that would harm people who've trusted me for years. So, no. You're leaving significant money on the table. I have enough money, Malcolm said. My mother looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she genuinely couldn't categorize. Then she looked at me. Is this what you want? And I realized she was actually asking. For the first time in my memory, she was asking me instead of telling me. Yes, I said, this is what I want. She left. She didn't slam the door. After my mother left, something in me contracted. I had watched Malcolm dismantle her in 40 words and felt, underneath the relief, something more complicated. The slow, queasy awareness that I had been moving steadily toward this man in a way I hadn't planned for and couldn't easily reverse. And that the original agreement, the practical contract, the clean arrangement with its implied exit had never accounted for the possibility that the arrangement might become real. I was afraid. Not of him, not of the situation. Afraid of wanting something that I had arrived at through such strange and accidental circumstances. Afraid that whatever I felt was the product of proximity and circumstance and gratitude, the way you love a lifeboat, not a person. I had seen my mother love a company more than a daughter. I had been raised in a house where desire was a negotiation and affection was a quarterly review. I did not trust my own feelings the way people who had been trusted with their feelings could. And there was the asymmetry problem. He had known who I was. He had resources and connections and visibility that made my original proposition, I'll help you financially, almost funny in retrospect. The entire premise of our arrangement had been constructed on a false balance of power. I had thought I was offering something. I wasn't sure anymore what I had actually been offering, or whether it had been received as anything other than an interesting complication in a life that was already complicated in ways I didn't yet understand. So I made distance. It felt like the intelligent thing. It felt like the responsible thing. It felt, I recognized in my more honest moments, like running, but I called it something else, and it was easier that way. I started keeping more distance. I was polite, but I was absent. I worked longer hours at a freelance consulting arrangement I'd pulled together. I came home after Naomi was in bed. I found ways to be in the apartment without actually being present in it. Malcolm noticed. He was too observant not to. But he didn't press. He made space with the same ease with which he did everything quietly, completely, without announcement. It was Naomi who called me out. She found me in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, 9 days into my manufactured distance, and she sat across from me and looked at me with the particular terrifying directness of a 7-year-old who has decided to say a thing. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "No," I said. "You act like you're leaving." "I'm just busy, Naomi." "You're here, but you're not here," she said. "Daddy does that sometimes when he's scared." "I'm not scared." She tilted her head at me. "Daddy says that too." I sat very still. "You have sad eyes again," she said, "the lost kind." She slid off her chair and went to the living room and came back with a Spinosaurus and put it on the table between us. "You can hold him if you want. He helps." I held the Spinosaurus. It was absurd, and it helped. That evening, Malcolm came and sat beside me on the fire escape. He'd brought the rosemary pot in for the winter, but he still went out there sometimes just to look at the city, and we sat in the cold for a while without talking. "You don't have to decide anything," he said eventually. "The arrangement is what you need it to be." "I don't know what I need," I said. "I know," he said. "That's fine." "Is it?" The city was quiet in the way it sometimes got at night, the snow-absorbing sound, the skyline doing its insistent glittering thing across the dark. "I'm not good at this," I said. "What?" "Not knowing. I've spent my whole life having the outcome specified in advance. I was going to marry the right person and run the right company, and my life was going to be structurally sound, even if it was structurally empty." I paused. "I don't know how to want something I didn't plan for." He was quiet for a moment. "Naomi's mother," he said. "I didn't plan for her either. I was 22 and living in a one-bedroom in Wicker Park, and she walked into a hardware store where I was buying pipe fittings and told me I was doing it wrong." He paused. She was right. She was right about most things. And I had 4 years with her that were better than everything before them combined. And I'd walk into that hardware store wrong 1,000 more times if it meant I got to have them. He looked out at the city. You can plan for structure. You can't plan for the thing that makes structure worth having. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Naomi said you have scared eyes." "She's observant?" "What are you scared of?" He turned to look at me. His expression was, for once, completely open. No recalibration, no quiet management, just the thing underneath. The same thing he said simply. Having something worth keeping. What broke my manufactured distance wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a document. Becca, who had apparently been running a low-grade investigation on my behalf out of loyalty and curiosity, sent me a scan of a filing from the Illinois Commerce Commission. An objection to a proposed development that would have affected the affordable housing units currently operating on a parcel of land in the South Loop. The objection had been filed 6 weeks ago, before I'd ever sat down at Malcolm's coffee shop table. The parcel was one my mother had been trying to acquire. The objection had blocked the acquisition and protected 32 families who lived in the existing housing units from displacement. The filing was under the name of DM Capital. I sat with this for an hour before I understood the full geometry of it. My mother's South Loop project, the one she'd offered to trade in the joint venture proposal Malcolm had refused, would have meant significant revenue for Carter Holdings. Malcolm's objection had already cost her that revenue before the marriage. The deal he'd refused in our living room would have restored it, and he'd refused it anyway. I called Becca back. How long has he been blocking her projects? 18 months, Becca said. That I can find. Emily, this man has been systematically acquiring properties that your mother was targeting for a year and a half based on what I'm seeing, because her development approach displaces existing tenants without adequate relocation support. He's been buying the parcels instead and keeping the existing residents in place. I sat down on the floor. The Spinosaurus was on the coffee table. I looked at it. He knew who I was, I said. When you approached him? Yes. So he knew I was Victoria Carter's daughter, Becca said, slowly. And he still said yes. He still let me into his home. I stopped. He had known my mother was the person he'd been working against for 18 months. And when her daughter had sat down at his table with a desperate and slightly unhinged proposition, he hadn't turned it into leverage. He hadn't mentioned it. He had just given me what I needed. Quietly. Without cost. The thing that broke open in me then wasn't romantic in the storybook sense. It was quieter and more fundamental than that. It was the recognition of someone who had made a choice, repeatedly and without announcement, to do the thing that was right rather than the thing that was expedient. I had been raised by a woman who didn't believe those two categories overlapped. I needed to go home. I found him in Naomi's room reading to her something about Patagonian fossil sites, which was apparently the next research frontier. Naomi was almost asleep, but not quite, her small face tipped toward the page with the focused expression that she maintained even in near sleep. I stood in the doorway until she was fully asleep, which took about 4 minutes. Malcolm came out and pulled the door nearly closed. He looked at me and waited. You've been blocking my mother's projects for 18 months, I said. You knew who I was and you never used it. He looked at me very steadily. Why would I? Because you could have. Because I came to you in a weak position and you had information that would have changed the terms entirely. And you... My voice caught. You didn't say anything. It wasn't relevant to what you needed. It was relevant to you. Emily, he said my name with the same quality as everything else he said. Quiet, complete, no wasted space. You came to me because you needed help. What you knew about me, what I knew about you, none of that changes what help looks like. I looked at him across the dim hallway of the small apartment. The city outside was making its nighttime sounds, muffled by the snow that had started again. The soft, persistent snow that Chicago offered all winter as both punishment and consolation. The arrangement, I said, the contract. I don't want to honor it. Something in his face shifted. I don't want the exit clause, I said. I don't want the end date. I don't want to have come up with the most accidentally correct solution in my life and then exited on schedule. I stopped. I want to stay. Not because it's convenient, because I want to. He was quiet for a moment. Then Naomi is going to want to know your opinion on whether Patagonia or Montana is more significant for late Cretaceous research. That seems like an impossible question. She has strong views. You'll want to be prepared. Are you going to answer me? He looked at me. The window thing happened again. That slight fractional opening. And this time, he didn't close it. Stay, he said. Please. The next morning I called my mother. Not from a position of negotiation, not with terms. I called her the way you call someone when you've decided to stop fighting about the thing that was never the real fight and start talking about what's actually there. She answered on the second ring. I'm not coming back to Carter Holdings on your terms, I said. If you want my involvement, it's on terms we negotiate as equals, including the board seat and including my right to disagree with acquisition strategies that harm existing residents. If that doesn't work for you, I'll build something separately. She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "You sound like you've made a decision." "I have." He influenced this. "I influenced this," I said. "That's the point." Another silence. "The board seat," she said. "We can discuss terms." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a capitulation. It was a door opening a degree, which for Victoria Carter was a seismic event. "Lunch next week," I said. "Tuesday." "The club." "Somewhere else," I said. "A pause." "Fine," she said. "Somewhere else." I hung up. Malcolm was in the kitchen making coffee, actual coffee, the real kind, which he'd acquired in week 2 and had continued to provide every morning without comment. Naomi was at the table with her research materials, a cup of orange juice, and the kind of profound focus that means a 7-year-old has reached a conclusion. "Montana is more significant for ornithischian diversity," she announced. "But Patagonia wins for sauropod evolution. They're not the same question." "That's a sophisticated distinction," I said. She looked up. "Are you staying?" I looked at Malcolm. He was watching me over the coffee he was pouring with the small, genuine, unguarded smile that he produced occasionally and that I recognized organizing my life around. "Yes," I said. "Good," Naomi said, and turned back to her research. "Because I need an objective second opinion on the sauropod data. And Daddy is biased toward Montana." "I'm not biased," Malcolm said. "You are," she and I said simultaneously. He looked at us across the kitchen of the small apartment on Huron Street, in the city that never forgives but sometimes. On winter mornings with snow coming down and coffee getting warm and neverly never in a 7-year-old conducting serious dinosaur research at the kitchen table, sometimes relents. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The parking meter in the snow, the coffee shop, the courthouse clerk who had witnessed stranger things, the apartment I had arrived in with one suitcase, and the specific kind of pride that comes from refusing to let someone see that you're afraid. Naomi's Spinosaurus on the kitchen table. The rosemary on the fire escape. Malcolm reading meditations in a coffee shop at 11 inches the morning with snowflakes in his hair, looking like a man who had arrived at a decision about how to live. I thought about my mother in the club with her gray eyes and her straight spine, saying, "He'll disappoint you," with the certainty of someone who had organized her life around never being disappointed by anything because she'd never let anything matter enough to disappoint her. And I thought that there was a kind of safety in that, a cold, evacuated, functional safety, and that I had been living inside it for 26 years, and that I was, as of this snowy morning, no longer willing to. Wanting something was not weakness. Being changed by it was not failure. Arriving somewhere you hadn't planned, through routes you couldn't have mapped, and recognizing it as home that was not accident. That was the thing. Naomi looked up from her research. "You're both being quiet," she said. "That either means you're thinking or you're being weird." "Both," Malcolm said. "That tracks," she said, and turned back to her notes. Outside, the snow was falling. Inside, the light was warm. The rosemary on the fire escape had survived another winter. I understood finally what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be. Not because someone had decided it for you, but because you had walked toward it one strange and accidental step at a time until you arrived somewhere real. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a kitchen, and a child, and a man pouring coffee, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of having chosen with your whole self where to stand. I stood there.
How many single dads have to stay 10 steps ahead before people stop confusing control with care, push with a board seat, pressure with a joint venture, dress it up as a strategy, dress it out as concern? What would you have done? Walk away or stay and build something real anyway? If this story stayed with you, subscribe and be here for the next one. Because when power starts talking, the right feeling and the right marriage certificate can be the difference between protecting your pride and protecting your child.